I just want to share this section from Scott Santens' book, Let There Be Money, Understanding Modern Monetary Theory and Basic Income. I don't know a whole lot about inflation, so I found this section really interesting. Inflation, inflation, inflation. In 2020, the United States ran a deficit of $3.1 trillion, and at the end of the year, annual inflation was at 1.36%. The Federal Reserve's target rate is 2%. So even with historic deficit spending, it was unable to hit its goal, and that is not unusual. Also, because the Fed seeks an average of 2%, even with what may be considered to be high inflation for a matter of months, when the long-term average over 3 years is still below 2%, more inflation is needed to hit the target. Inflation also isn't the only danger that central banks want to avoid. Deflation is considered something to avoid even more than inflation, as it would create an incentive to not spend money, which would hurt businesses, which would cause layoffs, which would reduce incomes, which would even further reduce spending, creating a feedback loop of economic destruction. This is why central banks like a target of 2%. It's considered a kind of Goldilocks zone of inflation where there's an incentive to spend, but not so much incentive that there's a feedback loop in the other direction known as hyperinflation. Technology, however, is creating a deflationary force. As technology displaces workers, it reduces the spending of those unable to find new jobs that pay more instead of paying less, which is part of the reason why the Fed has been finding it so difficult to actually reach its 2% inflation target. This provides all the more reason to run a deficit to increase the money supply to directly increase consumer spending. Some amount of inflationary pressure in a deflationary environment is helpful, not harmful. There isn't even full agreement on 2% inflation as optimal. There are economists who believe it would be better to raise the target rate to 3% or even 4%, so as to create more room for the Fed to adjust interest rates for greater impact when necessary to intervene to avoid recessions. Some even believe that if Japan had a 4% target, that it would have been able to avoid its lost decade. So it's possible that at some point we'll even look back with a new consensus that a 2% inflation rate may actually be too low. It's also important to consider the trade-offs of inflation and unemployment, because a 1 percentage point increase in unemployment is 5 times worse for overall well-being than a 1 percentage point increase in inflation. If the inflation is higher than what we may want it to be in order to achieve a lower unemployment rate, then that trade-off is arguably the right trade-off to make. Inflation be damned. Now let's assume that the U.S. decides to put the pedal to the metal and that our capacity limit really does exist at a deficit of $6 trillion a year. Starting with a current deficit in July 2021 of $2.5 trillion and deficit financing an additional $3.5 trillion to send every adult in America a check for $1,200 each month for the entire year retroactively, what would potentially happen? Would the sky fall? Would it be the end of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency? First, it's important to understand that inflation isn't an across-the-board phenomenon that has across-the-board solutions. Inflation happens when demand for something is greater than supply of something. If everyone cashed out their $1,200 checks and hid it under their beds, there would be no inflationary impact at all, despite all the newly created money, because no increased demand would be expressed. What matters is buying something, not the money itself. Again, it also depends on what is bought. If everyone spent their $1,200 checks to expand their digital music collections, that demand wouldn't exceed the supply of digital songs available because there's no limit to those goods. They're infinite, so that wouldn't have any inflationary impact either. If everyone spent their $1,200 checks on stocks, stock prices would go up, which is another way of saying wealth would inflate. If everyone spent their $1,200 checks on Bitcoin, the value of Bitcoin would go up, not the cost of food. If everyone spent their $1,200 checks paying off their student loans, credit cards, car loans, mortgages, and every other form of private debt, that would be deflationary, not inflationary. Because again, paying off private debt functions in the same way taxes do. Both erase money from existence. Both drain the tub of water. The deflationary impact of paying off debts is also something to consider in regards to forgiving debt. If we were to forgive all student debt and then issue another stimulus check, that stimulus would be more inflationary than if the check had been issued absent student loan debt forgiveness. Inflation also has a psychological component that has nothing to do with supply and demand. If people believe inflation is going to happen, then workers can demand more money and businesses can demand higher prices. In this way, it can be a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where the opposite is also true. If people believe inflation will remain stable, it's more likely to stay that way. Inflation fear-mongering is thus counterproductive. So what kind of spending would actually be inflationary? In 2020, demand for used cars increased, and the prices of used cars increased as a result. More people wanting a limited supply of stuff can lead to the price of that stuff rising as people compete against each other to buy it. In the case of cars, lots of people relocated away from cities where they may not have needed cars, while simultaneously rental car companies that had sold off their fleets to survive 2020 wanted to rebuild their fleets, while also simultaneously a global microchip shortage reduced the production of new cars. This is a story of an unusual amount of demand for cars combined with an unusually low amount of cars, all in response to a pandemic, and it accounts for 1/3 of the present rate of inflation. Same with gas prices. During the 2020 shutdown, prices plummeted as most people stayed home and no longer drove anywhere. There was a lot more supply than demand. As a result, refineries closed, and as a result, our capacity to create gasoline shrank. In 2021, demand greatly expanded back to normal, but capacity in 2021 is still below 2020 capacity because some refineries permanently closed. It takes time to adjust to large changes in demand, and that's why gas prices are up, but they will come back down again as capacity grows and also as people continue shifting to electric cars. However, when supply can't meet demand, that still doesn't necessitate higher prices. Something else observed in 2020, when businesses weren't able to meet the demand of their customers, was that instead of raising prices, they increased wait times. If a business can only make 100 cakes in a day and there's a demand from 500 customers for 500 cakes, one response is to make a $40 cake cost $200. But another response is to make a waiting list for cakes so that the person at the end of the line has to wait 5 days to spend $40 instead of paying $200 with no wait at all. Time is therefore another important factor to consider. If everyone spent their $1,200 on the day they got it, that's a different inflationary impact than if everyone spent a bit of it every day for the entire month in a way that supply can keep up with. What ultimately always matters is demand and supply at any specific point in time. Supply and demand can also influence each other to the point that increased demand can even lead to lower prices. A powerful example of high demand leading to lower prices was the invention of fracking. Expensive oil prices made oil production extremely profitable, which led to the invention of a way to make a lot more oil. Whatever you think of fracking, it was an innovation that created a lot more gasoline, which brought prices down from over $4 a gallon to under $2 a gallon, which in turn made lots of other stuff cost less too because of the reduced costs of transportation. This also shows that demand exceeding supply can lead to temporary inflation, but then lead to strong deflation through a dramatic increase in supply through new investments and innovations. Increased demand can also lead to fewer total resources used. This may be counterintuitive, but when people have more money to spend, they can buy less of something, not more of it. Economists refer to this kind of product as an inferior good. As an example, think of cheap shoes versus nice shoes. If someone can't afford nicer shoes, they'll buy cheaper shoes, and the result can be buying pair after pair of cheap shoes instead of just the one nicer pair that would have lasted much longer. This ends up costing more in the long run and also ends up using more resources in the long run. Making sure people can afford to not buy inferior goods means a more efficient use of limited resources. So again, back to the question at hand, what happens when everyone starts getting $1,200 a month to spend via newly created money? The answer, if you haven't figured it out already, is that there's no certain answer. It all depends. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Some of the money will be spent in ways that doesn't impact inflation at all. Some will cause some inflation in some areas, while some will cause deflation in other areas. Some will cause temporary inflation before causing long-term deflation. And all of these responses exist within a central bank system equipped with tools to manage inflation rates, and also a federal government capable of implementing policies that themselves reduce demand or increase supply. And also competitive markets where business owners who avoid price increases can gain market share over any of their competitors who raise their prices. Again, the economy is a complex, adaptive system, not a static, unchanging machine. Many changes are temporary as new equilibriums are reached. What can be scary inflation one month can be below target the next. Inflation can be, and often is, temporary, especially during a pandemic, and inflation is something that can be intelligently managed and even utilized as a uniquely useful tool. And that's from Scott Santens' book, Let There Be Money. If that piqued your interest, you can get this book. I can't remember where. I think I got it on Amazon, but I think you can also get digital copies of it as well, which I think might be cooler to have because he's got these like parts of the text that I can tell were like hyperlinks to like more information about whatever he was talking about at that point. So that's kind of a cool thing. Anyway, I love Scott Santens. I hope y'all buy his book.